When I stepped into the Havenport courthouse that morning, my heart was heavy, but my back was straight. My own daughter, Victoria, smirked and rolled her eyes at me, whispering something to my ex-husband Richard that made them both laugh under their breath. To them, I was powerless, a woman clinging to the scraps of dignity life had left me. But then, everything shifted. Judge Samuel Whitaker lifted his gaze from the papers on his desk, and for the first time that day, his eyes met mine. He froze. The courtroom went silent. His gavel paused mid-air, and in a whisper that still echoes in my memory, he said, "Is that her?" The air changed instantly. Nathaniel Cross, their slick lawyer, dropped his pen. Richard's smirk vanished. Even Victoria's self-assured mockery faltered, confusion flickering across her face. They had underestimated me for the last time, and soon they would learn that beneath the quiet woman they dismissed stood a truth powerful enough to shatter every lie they built. I never thought my life would come to this, standing in a courtroom while my own flesh and blood tried to strip me of everything I'd worked for. But perhaps I should start at the beginning, before the courtroom drama, before the betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. My name is Evelyn Harper, and at 52, I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. I'd survived a divorce from Richard 15 years ago, raised our daughter Victoria mostly on my own, and built a quiet life in our coastal town of Havenport. The modest two-story home overlooking the bay wasn't much by Richard's new standards, but it was mine. The one thing I'd fought to keep in the divorce. "Mom, you really should consider downsizing," Victoria had said last Thanksgiving, her voice honeyed, but her eyes calculating as they swept across the living room. "This place is too much for you to manage alone." I'd smiled and refilled her wine glass. "I managed just fine, sweetheart." What I didn't say was that every corner of that house held memories. Victoria learning to walk across the worn hardwood floors, the kitchen where I'd taught her to bake her grandmother's recipes, the porch swing where I'd read her stories until she fell asleep against my shoulder. I couldn't put a price on those memories, but apparently Victoria and Richard could. The trouble began in earnest after Victoria's 30th birthday. She'd moved back to Havenport after living in Boston for several years, taking a job at the same investment firm where Richard had become a partner after our divorce. I was thrilled to have her close again, imagining Sunday dinners and morning walks along the shore. Instead, Richard re-entered her life, and mine, like a storm. "Evelyn, you're looking, well, tired," he'd said the first time he accompanied Victoria to dinner at my house. His eyes, still that penetrating blue that once made my heart race, now assessed me like property in need of renovation. Victoria laughed. "Dad, be nice." But nice wasn't in Richard's vocabulary anymore, if it ever had been. Over the following months, I noticed the shifts. Victoria called less. When she visited, she photographed rooms in my house, claiming she was getting ideas for her apartment. She began mentioning how forgetful I seemed, how disorganized the house looked. "Mom forgot where she put her car keys again," she'd announced to Richard on the phone, rolling her eyes while I stood right there. "Third time this week?" It wasn't true. I'd misplaced them once after a particularly exhausting day at the library where I worked, but the narrative was being crafted without my input. Then came the meetings with financial advisors, who were actually Richard's colleagues. Suggestions that I might be happier in a retirement community, though I was only 52 and had no plans to retire from my librarian position. Concerned questions about my cognitive health when I refused to discuss selling my house. The final blow came on, a rainy Tuesday in April. I returned from work to find Victoria and Richard in my home office, going through my files. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard barely looked up. "Victoria's concerned about your paperwork, Evelyn. It's a mess." "We're just trying to help, Mom," Victoria added, but she couldn't meet my eyes. I stepped forward, noticing my father's old mahogany desk drawer was open, the drawer that contained the deed to the house, my will, and my father's letter to me. "Those are private documents." "Private? From your own daughter?" Victoria's tone was incredulous, as if I'd slapped her. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dad. She's becoming paranoid." "I think we need to discuss guardianship," Richard said, speaking to Victoria as if I weren't standing right there. For her own protection. My hands began to shake. "Get out of my house." They exchanged that look, the one that confirmed all my fears. They'd been planning this, strategizing how to take control of my life, my home, my independence. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly." I said, "Get out." My voice found its strength, echoing through the house that had been too quiet for too long. They left, but not without Victoria tearfully telling me I needed help, that they were only doing what was best for me. As their car pulled away, I sank to the floor beside my father's desk, rain pounding against the windows like my heart against my ribs. It was there, with trembling fingers, that I checked the secret compartment my father had shown me before he died. Relief flooded me. When I found everything still there, the real deed, the investments documentation, and most importantly, the letter about Judge Samuel Whitaker. A week later, I was served with papers. Victoria and Richard were petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent, to appoint Victoria as my guardian with control over all my assets and decisions. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. I overheard Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store. Such a shame about Evelyn Harper. Her daughter's putting her in a home, says she can't take care of herself anymore. I stopped attending church, declined dinner invitations. Each day I went to work at the library, smiled at the patrons, and came home to sit on my porch and watch the waves, wondering how my little girl had become a stranger who wanted to erase me. The night before the hearing, Victoria came alone. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice gentler than it had been in months. "The judge will side with us. Dad's friends with his golf buddy, and our lawyer has never lost a case like this." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She wore the pearl earrings I'd given her for her college graduation, but everything else was new money. The designer purse, the subtle but expensive highlights in her hair, the watch that probably cost more than I made in 3 months at the library. "Why, Victoria?" I asked simply. "Why are you doing this?" She sighed as if I were a child who couldn't understand basic instructions. "Because you're not capable of managing on your own anymore. This house is worth a fortune with the waterfront property values going up. You could live comfortably in a nice facility with the proceeds." And there it was, the truth beneath the concern. The house. The money. And what happens to the rest of the money after this nice facility is paid for? Her cheeks flushed. "That's not fair. I'm your daughter, your only heir." I nodded slowly. "Yes, you are my daughter. And tomorrow, we'll both remember what that truly means." She left frustrated, confident in her victory. She had no idea what awaited us all in that courtroom the next morning. No idea at all. The morning of the hearing dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that usually lifted my spirits. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress I'd owned for years but rarely. Worn, classic, simple, dignified. My mother's cameo brooch at my throat, my father's courage in my heart. As I drove to the courthouse, memories flooded back. 25 years earlier, I'd walked these same marble halls, not as a defendant, but as a young paralegal working for my father's small practice. It was here I first met Samuel Whitaker, long before he became a judge, back when he was just Sam, a struggling law student with a brilliant mind and a heavy secret. My father had hired him as a summer clerk, seeing potential where other firms saw only risk. I remember the day everything changed for Sam, the day that now, decades later, might change everything for me. I parked my car and sat for a moment, remembering my father's words. "Evelyn, there's power in knowing things, but greater power in knowing when to reveal them." The courtroom was already crowded when I arrived. Richard sat at the front with Victoria and their attorney, Nathaniel Cross, a shark in an expensive suit with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness. I recognized several neighbors, some looking concerned, others clearly there for the spectacle. Mrs. Peterson from the garden club gave me a pitying smile. My own attorney, Maria Gonzalez, met me at the door. I'd chosen her carefully, not one of the high-powered firms Richard would expect, but a sharp, determined woman who had once been my student when I taught community college classes years ago. "Are you ready?" Maria asked, her voice low. I nodded. "Everything in order?" "Just as you instructed. Documents are ready, witnesses prepped." We took our, seats. Victoria glanced back, rolling her eyes when she saw my outfit, whispering something to Richard that made him smirk. Their confidence was palpable. They thought this was a formality, the outcome predetermined. Judge Samuel Whitaker entered, and everyone rose. He was older now, his hair silver, his face lined, but I would have known him anywhere. He called the court to order efficiently. No indication that this case was anything but routine. "We're here regarding the petition for guardianship of Evelyn Harper," he announced, reviewing the papers before him. "I understand the petitioners are Victoria Harper and Richard Harper, represented by Nathaniel Cross." "Yes, Your Honor," Cross replied smoothly. "We're seeking to establish that Mrs. Harper is no longer capable of managing her personal affairs, and financial decisions, and that guardianship should be transferred to her daughter, Victoria. The judge nodded. And Mrs. Harper is represented by? Maria stood. Maria Gonzalez, Your Honor, representing Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who vigorously contests this petition as both unnecessary and improperly motivated. Cross began his case, painting me as a declining woman slipping into confusion and paranoia. He called Richard first, who spoke with practiced concern about my deterioration. She was always forgetful, Richard said, his voice heavy with false worry. But lately, it's become dangerous. Leaving the stove on, forgetting to pay bills, becoming suspicious of neighbors who've been friends for years. All lies, but delivered with such conviction that I saw several heads nodding in the gallery. Victoria followed, her testimony more personal and therefore more wounding. Mom has always been emotionally fragile, she said, dabbing at non-existent tears. The divorce was hard on her. I think she never really recovered, and now with age, she sighed dramatically. Last month, I found expired food throughout her refrigerator. The house was in disarray. When I suggested help, she became irrationally angry, accused me of trying to steal from her. The character assassination continued. A neighbor testified that I wasn't myself lately. Richard's doctor friend mentioned observed cognitive decline, though he'd never examined me. Cross presented bank statements showing several late payments over the past year, during the period when I'd been dealing with my sister's cancer treatment in another state, a detail they conveniently omitted. Throughout it all, Judge Whitaker listened impassively, occasionally glancing at me with unreadable eyes. Not once did he show recognition, not once did he give any indication that we had history. When Cross finished, confident and smug, he turned to Maria. Your witness. Maria rose, calm and focused. Your Honor, before cross-examination, I'd like to submit evidence that directly contradicts the petitioner's claims. She presented a thick folder of documents, my complete medical records showing perfect cognitive health from a geriatric specialist I'd visited the previous month, financial statements demonstrating my responsible management, and affidavits from my colleagues at the library attesting to my competence and reliability. As these circulated to Cross, Victoria, and Richard, I watched their faces. Confusion, then concern, then something close to panic as they realized their narrative was being systematically dismantled. Furthermore, Maria continued, I'd like to present evidence that this petition was filed not out of concern for Mrs. Harper's well-being, but as part of a coordinated attempt to gain control of her assets, specifically her waterfront property. She produced emails between Richard and Victoria discussing the property's value and potential development opportunities, emails forwarded to me by Richard's assistant, a kind woman who had once been my friend and who was troubled by what she was witnessing. The courtroom stirred. Judge Whitaker's expression sharpened as he reviewed the emails. Mr. Cross, did you vet these allegations before bringing this petition? Cross stammered, clearly thrown off balance. Your Honor, the petitioner's financial interests don't negate their genuine concern. Actually, Maria interrupted, I have one more piece of evidence that speaks directly to motive. This was it, the moment everything would change. She nodded to me, and I stood, walking forward with steady steps to hand the judge the final document, a deed and investment portfolio that had been hidden in my father's desk. As Judge Whitaker took the papers, our eyes met fully for the first time. That's when it happened, the moment that would replay in my mind forever after. Recognition dawned in his eyes, and he froze, gavel halfway raised. Is that her? He whispered so softly that only those closest could hear. In that moment, the air changed. Victoria's smug certainty wavered. Richard's confident posture stiffened. Nathaniel Cross dropped his pen, scrambling to retrieve it with suddenly clumsy fingers. The truth was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Whitaker examined the documents in his hands. I could almost see the memories flickering behind his eyes. Memories of a summer 30 years ago, when a young law clerk's career and life hung in the balance. Your Honor, Maria said calmly, these documents establish that Mrs. Harper is not only fully competent to manage her affairs but is, in fact, the majority stakeholder in Harper Development Group, the company Mr. Harper has been running as if it were solely his for the past 15 years. Richard's face drained of color. That's impossible, he hissed. Judge Whitaker looked up, his composure regained but his eyes holding a new awareness. Mr. Cross, Did your clients disclose this information during your preparation for this case? Cross fumbled through his papers, clearly blindsided. Your Honor, I was informed that Mrs. Harper had relinquished all business interests during the divorce settlement. She did not, Maria interrupted. The divorce settlement granted Mr. Harper operational control of the business, while Mrs. Harper retained 51% ownership as the original inheritor of her father's company. This arrangement was made to provide stability for their daughter, with the understanding that profits would be shared appropriately. Victoria turned to Richard, confusion and the first flickers of doubt crossing her face. Dad? Richard wouldn't meet her eyes. Instead, he leaned urgently toward Cross, whispering harshly as the lawyer nodded and then stood. Your Honor, these documents are irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're here to establish Mrs. Harper's competency, not to litigate old business arrangements. Judge Whittaker set the papers down carefully. On the contrary, Mr. Cross, if your client has been misrepresenting Mrs. Harper's business interests while simultaneously attempting to have her declared incompetent, it speaks directly to motive and credibility. He turned to me then, his expression neutral but his eyes communicating volumes. Mrs. Harper, would you like to address the court? I stood, feeling surprisingly steady despite the thundering of my heart. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Walking to the witness stand, I felt every eye in the courtroom on me. Gone was the meek, confused woman they expected. In her place stood the daughter of James Bennett, one of Havenport's most respected attorneys, and the rightful owner of both the property they coveted and the company. Richard had used to build his reputation. After I was sworn in, Maria approached. Mrs. Harper, could you explain your relationship with Harper Development Group? The company was founded by my father in 1962, I began, my voice growing stronger with each word. When he died in 1988, I inherited his controlling interest. I was already married to Richard at the time, working as a paralegal in my, father's firm while raising Victoria. Richard expressed interest in running the company, and I agreed, provided certain conditions were met. What conditions were those? That the company would remain family-owned, that a portion of profits would be set aside for Victoria's future, and that the coastal properties, including my current home, would never be developed commercially. My father had purchased that land to preserve it. I glanced at Richard, whose jaw was clenched so tightly I could see a muscle twitching. When we divorced in 2008, Richard insisted on maintaining operational control of the company. I agreed, again with conditions, that my ownership stake would be acknowledged, that I would receive quarterly financial reports, and that all major decisions would require my approval. And did Mr. Harper honor those conditions? For the first few years, yes, but the reports gradually became less detailed, then stopped altogether. When I inquired, I was told the company was restructuring, and there was nothing to report. I suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it until recently. Maria nodded. And what changed recently? I took a deep breath. 3 months ago, my sister's illness brought me to Philadelphia for several weeks. While I was gone, someone entered my home and searched through my father's desk, the desk where I kept important family documents. When I returned, I noticed subtle differences in how things were arranged. That's when I decided to check the secret compartment my father had built into the desk, a compartment only he and I knew about. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Richard stared straight ahead, his face a mask. Inside, I found the original deed to the coastal property, showing that it was never personally owned by either Richard or myself, but was held in trust by Bennett Holdings, a separate entity my father created to protect the land. I also found financial reports Richard had never shared with me, reports showing that Harper Development had become tremendously profitable over the past decade, with none of those profits being properly distributed to me as the majority owner. And what about the apartment building where Victoria currently lives? Maria asked. That too is owned by Bennett Holdings. Victoria has been living there rent-free, believing it was a gift from her father. In reality, it's been part of my inheritance all along. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Victoria's face had gone white, her eyes darting between Richard and me as if trying to determine who was lying. Judge Whittaker called for order, his gavel striking with authority. Your Honor, Cross interjected, these allegations, even if true, have no bearing on Mrs. Harper's mental competency. On the contrary, Maria countered, they establish that Mrs. Harper has been systematically misled by the very people now claiming she is incompetent. More importantly, they demonstrate that the petitioners have a significant financial motive to gain control of her affairs. Judge Whittaker nodded. I'm inclined to agree, Mr. Cross. This petition appears less concerned with Mrs. Harper's welfare than with controlling her assets. He turned to me. Mrs. Harper, do you have anything else you wish to share with the court? This was the moment, the one I'd both dreaded and anticipated. I looked directly at the judge. Yes, Your Honor. I believe there's another matter of credibility the court should consider. Cross jumped to his feet. Objection. We're straying far from the matter at hand. I'll decide. What's relevant, Mr. Cross? Judge Whitaker said firmly. Please continue, Mrs. Harper. I straightened my shoulders. In 1994, I worked as a paralegal for my father's law firm. That summer, we hired a promising law student as a clerk, Samuel Whitaker. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Judge Whitaker's face remained impassive, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes. One evening, I was working late when I found Samuel in my father's office, distraught. He had just learned that the Bar Association was investigating an incident from his undergraduate years, an incident that, while relatively minor, could have prevented him from being admitted to the bar due to stringent character requirements at that time. I paused, choosing my words carefully. My father and I helped Samuel prepare his defense, gathering evidence and testimonials that placed the incident in proper context. The investigation was dismissed, and Samuel went on to have a distinguished legal career. Your Honor, Cross interrupted, if Mrs. Harper is suggesting some improper influence, I am suggesting nothing of the sort, I said firmly. I am simply establishing that I have known Judge Whitaker for many years and can attest to his integrity. What I found troubling was learning recently that Richard had been boasting about his influence with the court through their supposed friendship, something I know Judge Whitaker would never countenance. Richard half rose from his seat, his face flushed. That's a damn lie. Mr. Harper, Judge Whitaker's voice cracked like thunder. Control yourself or I'll have you removed. Richard sank back, glaring at me with undisguised hatred. The judge turned to me, his expression grave. Mrs. Harper, are you suggesting that the petitioners believed they had undue influence over these proceedings? I have evidence indicating that was their belief, yes. My attorney has submitted emails between Richard and Victoria discussing how their connection to you would ensure a favorable outcome. I met his gaze steadily. I brought this up not to embarrass you, Your Honor, but because I believe in your integrity, and because the court should be aware of the petitioner's attempt to manipulate these proceedings. Judge Whitaker's face hardened as he turned to Cross. Counselor, I'll be reviewing these allegations thoroughly. If I find evidence of attempted influence, there will be serious consequences. Victoria leaned forward, whispering urgently to Richard, who shook his head sharply. The confidence that had surrounded them like an aura was crumbling visibly. Judge Whitaker shuffled through the papers before him, then looked up. In light of the evidence presented, I'm prepared to rule on this petition immediately, unless counsel has further witnesses. Cross glanced at Richard, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. No further witnesses, Your Honor. Very well. The judge's voice filled the courtroom. Based on the comprehensive medical evidence presented, I find no basis whatsoever for declaring Mrs. Evelyn Harper incompetent. The petition for guardianship is denied. I closed my eyes briefly, relief washing through me. Furthermore, Judge Whitaker continued, I find troubling evidence of potential financial misconduct, attempted undue influence on the court, and possible fraud regarding the management of Bennett Holdings and Harper Development Group. I am referring these matters to the district attorney's office for investigation. He fixed Richard with a stern gaze. Mr. Harper, I suggest you consult with separate counsel immediately. Mr. Cross, given the potential conflicts of interest that have emerged, you may wish to consider your continued representation carefully. With a final strike of his gavel, it was over. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversations as Richard and Cross huddled urgently at their table. Victoria sat alone, staring at her hands. As I stood to leave, Judge Whitaker caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. Acknowledgement of a debt repaid, of truth finally having its day. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows as I stepped into the hallway, Maria beside me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the hearing was beginning to ebb, leaving me both exhausted and strangely light, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. That was unexpected, Maria said quietly, a smile playing at her lips. You didn't tell me about your history with Judge Whitaker. Some secrets are best held close until needed, I replied, echoing my father's wisdom. We were heading toward the exit when Victoria's voice called out behind us. Mom, wait! I turned to see my daughter hurrying down the corridor, her heels clicking against the marble. Her face was flushed, her carefully applied makeup smudged slightly at the corners of her eyes. For the first time in months, she looked like my daughter again, not the polished stranger who had sat in that courtroom. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Maria gave me a questioning look. "I'll wait by the car," she said, tactfully withdrawing. Victoria and I moved to a quiet alcove near the window. Outside, life in Havenport continued. Boats bobbing in the harbor, people strolling along the waterfront, unaware of how completely my world had just shifted. "Is it true?" Victoria asked finally. "About Dad and the company? About the apartment?" I nodded. "All of it. Why didn't you ever say anything? All these years." "What would have been the point?" I asked softly. "After the divorce, you chose your father. You believed I was the one holding you back, that I was, what did you call me? Small town and small-minded." She flinched. "I was 22 and stupid. You were hurt and looking for someone to blame. I understood that." Victoria leaned against the window frame, suddenly looking exhausted. "Did you know what Dad was planning? With the guardianship petition?" "Not until recently. I suspected something when you both started commenting on my forgetfulness, but I didn't realize how far it had gone until I found you in my office that day." She had the grace to look ashamed. "He said it was for your own good, that you were declining, that we needed to protect you." She shook her head. "I believed him. Or maybe I wanted to believe him because the alternative was—" Her voice trailed off. "That your father was using you to get control of my property and my shares in the company." I finished for her. Victoria nodded, tears welling in her eyes. How could I have been so blind? I felt the anger that had sustained me begin to soften at the edges. This was still my daughter, misguided, manipulated, but still mine. Richard has always been persuasive. It's what made him a good businessman and a terrible husband. All those things I said about you in court." She broke off, wiping hastily at her eyes. "I don't even know if I believed them. It was like once we started down this path, I couldn't see any other way." We stood in silence for a moment, the gulf of hurt and mistrust between us seeming both unbridgeable and yet somehow narrower than before. "What happens now?" Victoria finally asked. "With the company? With Dad? That depends on what the district attorney finds. Richard will likely face serious questions about his management of the company and the missing profits. As for the company itself," I sighed. "I never wanted to run it, Victoria. I wanted to be a librarian, to raise you, to live quietly in my home by the sea. The company was just a responsibility I inherited." Victoria looked up, a question in her eyes. "Then why keep the controlling interest all these years?" "Because it was what my father wanted. To keep the company in the family, to preserve the coastal land. And because someday I thought you might want to understand your grandfather's legacy." Her shoulders slumped. "And instead, I tried to take it from you." I reached out tentatively, touching her arm. "You didn't know the whole story." "That's no excuse." She straightened, looking more like the confident young woman I'd raised and less like Richard's puppet. "I need to make this right, Mom. I don't know how yet, but I need to." Before I could respond, a commotion near the courtroom doors caught our attention. Richard emerged, his face thunderous, Cross hurrying alongside him. When he spotted us, he changed direction, heading straight for our alcove. "You think you've won," he snarled, stopping just short of us, his voice low but venomous. "You have no idea what you've done. The company will collapse if this gets out." I faced him calmly. "If the company can't survive honest accounting and proper profit distribution, then perhaps it shouldn't survive at all." "Dad," Victoria said, stepping slightly away from me. "What did you do with Mom's share of the profits?" Richard's gaze snapped to her. "Don't tell me you're buying her act. This is what she does, Victoria. Plays the victim, makes everyone else feel guilty." I watched as Victoria drew herself up, something resolute settling in her expression. "Answer the question, Dad. Where is the money?" Cross placed a warning hand on Richard's arm. "This isn't the place, Richard. We need to strategize before—" "Before what?" Victoria pressed. "Before the truth comes out? It already has." Richard's face contorted with rage and something else. Fear, I realized. For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard Harper was afraid. "Victoria," he said, his tone changing to the persuasive cadence I remembered so well. "Sweetheart, this is complicated business. Your mother doesn't understand." "Stop." Victoria's voice was quiet but firm. "Just stop. I'm not that naive anymore." She turned to me. "Mom, I think I need some time to process all this. But," she hesitated, then continued more determinedly, "but I want you to know I'm sorry. For everything. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. I nodded, unexpected tears pricking at my eyes. Take all the time you need. As Victoria walked away, Richard stared after her, then turned back to me, his expression hardening. This isn't over, Evelyn. Yes, Richard, I said softly. It is. I watched him stride away, Cross hurrying after him, and felt nothing but a profound weariness. 15 years of marriage, a daughter we both loved, a life we had shared, all of it poisoned by greed and resentment. Outside, Maria was waiting by her car, talking on her phone. When she saw me approach, she quickly ended her call. Everything all right? She asked, concern evident in her voice. I looked back at the courthouse, thinking of all that had transpired within its walls today. Not yet, I answered honestly, but I think it might be, someday. As we drove back to my home that was still mine, that would remain mine, I watched the familiar streets of Havenport pass by. The town where I'd grown up, fallen in love, raised a daughter, had my heart broken. The town where today I had finally found my voice. The coastal road, curved along the shoreline, and suddenly there it was, my house on the bluff, windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. For the first time in months, the sight of it filled me not with anxiety, but with peace. What will you do now? Maria asked as we pulled into the driveway. I thought of Victoria's confused pain, of Richard's rage, of the investigations to come. I thought of the company that was now undeniably mine, of responsibilities I had never sought. And I thought of my quiet life at the library, of the small joys that had sustained me through the darkest times. Heal, I said simply, and then decide what comes next. As Maria drove away, I climbed the steps to my porch and sat in the old swing, listening to the waves below. The battle was over, but the war had left scars that would take time to fade. Still, for the first time in a very long time, I looked toward the future with hope rather than dread. The truth had finally come to light. And in that light, perhaps even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. The weeks following the courthouse confrontation unfolded in a blur of legal meetings, uncomfortable revelations, and fragile new beginnings. Spring deepened into summer, the coastal breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibility through my open windows each morning. Richard, true to form, did not go quietly. 3 days after the hearing, the Havenport Herald ran a front-page story about alleged financial improprieties at Harper Development Group. Richard had attempted to control the narrative, positioning himself as a victim of accounting misunderstandings. The article mentioned me only briefly, as the ex-wife with a contested ownership claim. I might have let it go, might have continued my quiet life at the library while the lawyers sorted through the financial tangle. If not for what happened the following weekend, I was in the garden, tending to my hydrangeas, when Mrs. Peterson appeared at my fence. Evelyn, she called, her voice carrying the distinctive tone of someone about to deliver gossip. I just wanted to see how you're holding up with all this unpleasantness. I straightened, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. I'm well, thank you. Such a shame about Victoria's apartment building. Richard was telling everyone at the club that you're evicting her. Seems rather harsh, doesn't it? My secateurs paused, mid-cut. Excuse me? Oh. Her hand fluttered to her throat. Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned. No, please continue. I set my tools down carefully. I'd very much like to hear what Richard's been saying. By that evening, I had a complete picture, courtesy of 3 more neighbors, and a concerned call from my sister in Philadelphia. Richard had spun an elaborate tale. I was mentally unstable, but clever enough to manipulate the judge. I was vindictively seizing company assets. I was evicting my own daughter out of spite. The story had spread through Havenport's social circles with the speed of wildfire. That night, I sat at my father's desk, surrounded by the financial documents I'd been sorting through with my new accountant. The company was worth far more than I had imagined, and the irregularities in Richard's management ran deeper than simple profit skimming. There were suspicious property transfers, questionable partnerships, and a systematic effort to dilute my ownership through a maze of subsidiaries. My phone lit up with a text from Victoria. Can we talk tomorrow? Neutral ground? We met at the Blue Dolphin Cafe the next morning, a place we'd frequented during her high school years, before college, and Richard's influence had pulled her away. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at our old corner table, 2 cups of coffee waiting. I ordered your usual, she said, as I slid into the seat across from her. Black with 1 sugar, right? It was such a small thing remembering how I took my coffee, but it caught in my throat unexpectedly. Thank you, Victoria looked tired, dark circles under her eyes partially concealed by makeup. Dad's saying you're going to evict me. And do you believe that? She stared into her latte. A week ago, I might have. Now I don't know what to believe anymore. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. I have no intention of evicting you, Victoria. The building is legally mine, yes, but your home is your home. She nodded, relief visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. I've been talking to a lawyer of my own, not Dad's. Someone independent. That's wise. They say... She hesitated, then continued more firmly. They say Dad's been using my name on some company documents without my knowledge, that I might be legally implicated in some of his financial maneuvers. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it should have. Richard had always used those closest to him as pawns in his larger game. What are you going to do? Cooperate with the investigation. Her eyes, so like mine, met mine directly. Tell the truth, whatever it costs. Pride swelled in my chest. Pride in this daughter who, despite everything, had found her moral compass. It won't be easy. No. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. But you taught me that doing the right thing rarely is. We talked for over an hour. Really talked, in a way we hadn't in years. About the company, about her childhood memories, about the subtle ways Richard had driven wedges between us. Not everything was resolved. There were moments of tension, flashes of the hurt that still lingered, but it was a beginning. As we prepared to leave, Victoria hesitated. Mom, there's something else you should know. Dad's planning something. I don't know what exactly, but he's been meeting with investors, making calls at all hours. He's desperate. Thank you for telling me. I squeezed her hand briefly. Be careful around him right now. You too. We parted on the sidewalk outside, an awkward moment where neither of us quite knew whether to hug. In the end, Victoria gave a small wave and walked toward her car. I watched her go, thinking how strange it was that rebuilding could sometimes be harder than the initial destruction. The warning about Richard proved prescient. 2 days later, Maria called with news that Richard had filed an emergency motion challenging the ownership documents I'd presented in court, claiming they were fraudulent. It's a desperate move, she assured me, but we'll need to appear before Judge Whitaker again to address it. This time, the courtroom felt different. The gallery was nearly empty, just a handful of legal aides and a lone reporter from the Herald. Richard sat alone at his table, cross nowhere to be seen. When Victoria entered a few minutes before proceedings began, she sat in the neutral middle section, nodding slightly to both Richard and me. Judge Whitaker wasted no time. I've reviewed Mr. Harper's motion and the supporting documentation. Mrs. Harper, your response? Maria stood. Your Honor, we have the original documents with provenance records, verification from the county clerk's office, and testimony from the attorney who drafted them. My client's late father, Mr. Harper's claim that these are fraudulent is itself a fraudulent attempt to delay the ongoing financial investigation. Richard's new attorney, a younger man with a nervous demeanor, attempted to argue technical points about document authentication, but his heart didn't seem in it. Judge Whitaker listened patiently before rendering his decision. Motion denied, he stated firmly. The ownership. Documents presented by Mrs. Harper have been verified to my satisfaction. Furthermore, Mr. Harper, I'm troubled by what appears to be a pattern of delaying tactics. This court will not be used as a tool to obstruct justice. As we left the courtroom, Richard brushed past me, his face tight with suppressed fury. You've ruined everything, he muttered. I built that company into what it is today. No, Richard, I replied quietly. My father built it. You just borrowed it for a while. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and pink, an unexpected visitor arrived. Judge Whitaker, dressed in casual clothes rather than his judicial robes, stood at the bottom of my steps. Judge Whitaker? I said, surprised. Samuel, please, I'm not here in an official capacity. He gestured to the empty chair beside me. May I? I nodded, and he settled into the Adirondack chair with a sigh. For a few minutes, we sat in companionable silence, watching the sky deepen from gold to crimson. I never properly thanked you and your father, he said finally, for what you did all those years ago. There's no need. You earned your success. He smiled, slightly. Perhaps, but without that second chance, he let the thought trail off. I was sorry to hear about James's passing. He was a good man. The best, I agreed. He taught me everything important, about law, about integrity, about keeping the right secrets. Samuel chuckled. and using them at precisely the right moment, apparently. His expression grew more serious. I want you to know that my ruling had nothing to do with our history. The evidence was clear. I never doubted that. He turned to face me more directly. What will you do with the company now? It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks, poring over financial reports late into the night, learning the business my father had built and Richard had exploited. Run it properly, I said simply. Honor my father's vision. Protect the coastal properties from development. That won't be easy with no business experience. I'm learning quickly. I smiled. And I have an unlikely new ally in Victoria. She's been working in finance for years. She understands the business side better than I ever will. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You trust her? After everything? The question gave me pause. Trust is a process, not a destination, I said finally. We're finding our way back to each other, step by step. As darkness fell, Samuel took his leave, pausing at the bottom of the steps. For what it's worth, Evelyn, I think James would be proud of how you handled all this. After he left, I remained on the porch, listening to the rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the shore below. In the weeks since the hearing, I'd experienced anger, vindication, sorrow, and tentative hope, sometimes all within the same hour. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, I felt something new, a sense of purpose, of rightness. The next morning, I called Victoria. I'd like to show you something, I said. Can you meet me at the Harper Development offices at 11? She sounded surprised. You're going to the office? Does Dad know? It's my company, I reminded her gently. And no, your father doesn't know yet. The Harper Development Group occupied the top 2 floors of Havenport's only true high-rise, a glass and steel structure that always seemed slightly out of place among the town's more traditional architecture. I had been there exactly twice. Once for the opening reception 15 years earlier, and once to sign the divorce papers in Richard's corner office with its sweeping views of the bay. When Victoria met me in the lobby, she looked both professional and wary in a tailored navy suit. What are we doing here, Mom? Reclaiming what's mine, I said, stepping into the elevator, and possibly offering you a job. Her eyebrows shot up. A job? Doing what? That depends on what we find upstairs. The receptionist's face when we stepped into the elegant lobby was a study in confusion. Mrs. Harper, we weren't expecting you. No, I imagine not. But as the majority shareholder, I don't actually need an appointment. I smiled to soften the words. Is Edward Blake in today? The CFO? 5 minutes later, we were seated in a conference room, Edward Blake looking distinctly uncomfortable as he shuffled papers before him. I had always liked Edward. He had been with the company since my father's time and had always treated me with respect during the rare occasions our paths crossed. Mrs. Harper, this is unexpected, he began. I imagine a lot of things have been unexpected lately, I replied. The court case, the investigation, my appearance here today. He nodded, cautiously. Mr. Harper has instructed us not to discuss company matters with anyone, including family members, during the ongoing situation. I understand loyalty, Edward, but I think you also understand legal reality. I own 51% of this company. The court has confirmed that fact. I slid a folder across the table. These are certified copies of the relevant documents. I'm here to begin taking an active role in the management of my company. Victoria, watching silently from beside me, straightened almost imperceptibly at the confidence in my voice. Edward reviewed the documents with the careful attention of a man whose professional world was shifting beneath his feet. What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Harper? He asked finally. First, complete transparency. I want to understand exactly what's been happening with the company's finances. Second, a reorganization of the leadership structure. I paused. And third, I'd like to offer my daughter Victoria a position as special advisor to help facilitate this transition. Victoria's head snapped toward me, surprise evident in her expression. I continued, she has financial experience, knowledge of the company's recent operations, and a vested interest in setting things right. Edward looked between us, calculation visible behind his professional mask. Mr. Harper won't like this. No, I agreed, he won't. But the question is, Edward, where do you stand? With the past or the future? The transformation of Harper Development Group began that day in the conference room, with Edward Blake reluctantly, but thoroughly walking me through the company's current structure, major projects, and financial status. By the time we finished, the sun was setting over the bay, casting long shadows across the sleek office. "So the Westridge project is the most concerning?" I asked, referring to a large mixed-use development that seemed to consume an inordinate amount of the company's resources. Edward nodded, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "It's Richard's passion project. He's leveraged significant company assets to acquire the land and begin preliminary work, despite several environmental concerns." "And where exactly is this project located?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "The old Marshall property, along the northern coastline. About 3 miles up from your house, actually." Victoria, who had been taking meticulous notes throughout our meeting, looked up sharply. "That's protected land. Grandfather specifically acquired those parcels to prevent development." Edward shifted uncomfortably. "The zoning was reinterpreted recently. Richard has some connections on the Planning Commission." I exchanged a glance with Victoria, seeing my own concern reflected in her eyes. "I'll need all the documentation on Westridge," I said, "and I think it's time to call a board meeting." As we left the building, Victoria walked beside me in thoughtful silence until we reached the parking lot. "Why did you do that?" she asked finally. "Offer me a position?" "Because you know the business. Because you're qualified." I paused, looking at her directly. "And because I believe in second chances." Her eyes filled unexpectedly. "After everything I did? The things I said in court? You were manipulated by your father, Victoria. You're not the first person Richard has used for his own purposes, and you won't be the last." I touched her arm briefly. "Besides, who better to help me understand what he's been doing than someone who's been watching from the inside?" She nodded slowly. "I'll need to quit my current position at the investment firm. Take whatever time you need to decide. This isn't an ultimatum." "No." A small, determined smile crossed her face. "No. I've already decided. I want to help fix this, Mom. I need to." That night, I expected Richard's angry call, but it never came. Instead, around 9 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it, to find Nathaniel Cross standing on my porch, his usual slick confidence replaced by something more subdued. "Mrs. Harper, may I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped back to allow him entry. He declined my perfunctory offer of tea, remaining standing in my living room, looking oddly out of place in his expensive suit among my comfortable, worn furniture. "I've withdrawn as Richard's counsel," he said without preamble. "I thought you should know." "Why?" He smiled thinly. "Professional ethics. Let's leave it at that." "And why tell me in person?" A courtesy call would have sufficed. Cross ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Because I owe you an apology. I took the guardianship case based on Richard's representations about your mental state. I failed to conduct proper due diligence." "You believed what you wanted to believe," I said. "What was financially beneficial to believe?" He didn't deny it. "I also came to warn you. Richard is not stable right now. He's making threats, reaching out to people with questionable reputations. I don't know what he's planning, but I felt you should be aware." The warning sent a chill through me, but I maintained a calm exterior. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Cross." After he left, I double-checked my locks and set the alarm system, something I rarely bothered with in quiet Havenport. Victoria's earlier warning and now Cross's unexpected visit suggested Richard might be more dangerous than I'd anticipated. I sent a quick text to Victoria. "Stay alert. R may be escalating." The next morning brought new complications. The district attorney's office called to arrange a formal interview regarding the financial improprieties at Harper Development. By afternoon, Edward Blake had emailed urgent news. Richard had been seen clearing out his office and removing files despite the ongoing investigation. And then, as if the universe were determined to test my newfound strength all at once, Mrs. Peterson appeared at my door with a copy of the Havenport Herald. "Thought you might want to see this, dear," she said, an unmistakable gleam of excitement in her eyes. "It's all over town already." The headline blared, "Harper family feud explodes. Ex-wife claims fortune, daughter caught in middle." The article was filled with quotes from sources close to the bomb. Family describing me as vengeful and unstable, Victoria as confused and manipulated, and Richard as the true victim, a hard-working businessman whose success had made him a target. I scanned the piece, noting the careful wording that stopped just short of actionable libel. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," I said, handing it back. "I appreciate you keeping me informed." "Will you be responding?" she asked eagerly. "Everyone's talking about it." "No," I said simply. "I won't be talking to the press." After she left, I called Maria. "We need to move quickly on the company reorganization. Richard's trying to control the narrative. Already on it, she assured me. The emergency board meeting is set for tomorrow morning. I've also filed for a temporary restraining order preventing Richard from removing any further documents or assets from the company. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria and I worked late into the night, reviewing company documents, preparing our presentation for the board. Despite the tension and uncertainty, there was something oddly healing about working side by side with my daughter, our shared purpose bridging some of the distance between us. I never knew you were so capable, Victoria commented during a late-night coffee break, her tone somewhere between admiration and regret. You never really knew me at all, I replied softly. Not the adult me, anyway. You knew me as Mom, the one who packed your lunches and helped with homework. But there was always more to me than that. She nodded slowly. I'm starting to see that. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the company headquarters. Victoria and I arrived early, steeling ourselves for what promised to be a contentious session. The boardroom gradually filled with nervous executives and board members, many of whom I recognized only vaguely from company functions years ago. At 8:55, Edward Blake approached us in the hallway outside. Richard's not coming, he said quietly. He sent a message to the board members last night claiming health issues. Victoria frowned. That's not like him. He'd never miss something this important. It's a tactic, I said. He's trying to delay, hoping to build support behind the scenes. But as we entered the boardroom, and I took my place at the head of the table, a position that was rightfully mine as majority shareholder, but felt foreign nonetheless, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. Richard was many things, but he was not a coward. His absence felt wrong, strategic in a way I couldn't yet decipher. I began the meeting with calm authority, introducing myself formally to board members who had long viewed me as merely Richard's ex-wife. I outlined the evidence of financial mismanagement, the legal, confirmation of my ownership stake, and my plans for restructuring the company leadership. Effective immediately, I concluded, Richard Harper is removed as CEO of Harper Development Group. I am appointing Edward Blake as interim CEO while we conduct a proper search for permanent leadership. The board's reaction was mixed. Concern from Richard's allies, relief from others who had apparently chafed under his leadership. Questions followed, which Victoria and I fielded with prepared confidence. By meeting's end, the transition was formally approved, though not without resistance from several board members with close ties to Richard. As we gathered our materials after the vote, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check the Westridge property, now. I showed it to Victoria, whose brow furrowed. Who sent this? I don't know. But given what we learned yesterday about Richard's passion project, I think we need to find out. We drove separately to the coastal property known as Westridge, a stretch of pristine shoreline my father had purchased decades ago specifically to protect it from the kind of development Richard had apparently been planning. As we turned onto the access road, Victoria's car close behind mine, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The security gate stood open, and in the distance I could see heavy equipment, bulldozers and excavators, active on the property. I parked hastily and got out, Victoria joining me moments later. What the hell? She breathed, staring at the scene before us. Where there had once been protected dunes and native grasses, raw earth was now exposed. A section of coastline, perhaps 2 acres in size, had been completely cleared, the natural contours flattened in preparation for building. He started construction, I said in disbelief. Without final permits, without board approval, without your knowledge, Victoria finished. This is why he skipped the board meeting. He knew you'd stop the project, so he accelerated it. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling the Environmental Protection Office. This land is in a protected zone. As Victoria made her calls, I approached one of the workers, who regarded me warily. Who authorized this work? I demanded. Harper Development, he replied. We got the go-ahead yesterday afternoon. Rush job. I'm Evelyn Harper, majority owner of Harper Development Group, and I did not authorize this work. I showed him my identification. I need you to stop immediately. The man looked confused, then apologetic. Ma'am, our contract is with Richard Harper specifically. He was here himself at dawn, telling us to get as much done as possible today. A cold realization settled over me. He's trying to create a fait accompli, I murmured. Damage. The land so extensively that the preservation is moot. By the time environmental officials and the police arrived an hour later, the destruction was substantial. The natural dune system that had protected this stretch of coastline for centuries had been partially leveled. As I stood watching the workers reluctantly power down their equipment, a familiar car pulled up, Richard's silver Mercedes. He emerged looking neither surprised nor contrite. In fact, a small, satisfied smile played at his lips as he surveyed the scene. "What have you done?" I asked as he approached, keeping my voice level despite the anger coursing through me. "Business," he replied simply. "The Westridge development will bring jobs and tax revenue to Havenport. Progress can't be stopped because of sentimentality. Evelyn, this isn't about sentimentality. It's about the law. You don't have proper permits for this work." His smile widened. "Actually, I do. Emergency permits were granted yesterday by the Planning Commission. Ask them yourself." Victoria joined us, her face flushed with anger. "You bribed them, didn't you? This is illegal on multiple levels, Dad." Richard's expression hardened as he looked at our daughter. "So it's Dad again, is it? I wondered how long your mother's offer would take to turn you against me completely." "You did that yourself," Victoria replied quietly. "When you tried to declare Mom incompetent. When you used me as a pawn." An environmental officer approached, clipboard in hand. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." "That would be me," Richard and I said. Simultaneously, the situation devolved into a tense standoff, with Richard producing documentation that appeared legitimate, if suspiciously rushed, while I countered with proof of my majority ownership and the ecological protected status of the land. As we argued, I noticed Samuel Whitaker's car pull up. He approached our group with the measured pace of someone assessing a volatile situation. "Judge," the environmental officer acknowledged with obvious relief, "perhaps you can help clarify the legal status here." Samuel surveyed the scarred landscape, his expression grave. "I received a call about unauthorized development on protected land." His gaze shifted to Richard. "Mr. Harper, I believe there's an injunction preventing you from making major company decisions pending the financial investigation?" "This development was approved before any injunction," Richard countered smoothly. "The permits were granted yesterday." "By whom?" Samuel asked. "Commissioner Davis signed off personally." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Interesting, considering Commissioner Davis is currently in Boston attending his daughter's graduation. I know because I received his out-of-office reply when I emailed him this morning about an unrelated matter." Richard's confident facade cracked slightly. "His deputy, then. The approval is legitimate." The environmental officer, who had been making calls during our exchange, rejoined the conversation. "Judge Whitaker, we've confirmed with the planning office that no emergency permits were issued for this property. The documentation provided appears to be falsified." The color drained from Richard's face as he realized the depth of his miscalculation. In his desperate attempt to force the development forward, he had crossed from financial impropriety into outright criminal behavior. As the police began questioning Richard more formally, Victoria moved to stand beside me, her expression a complex mixture of sorrow and resolve. "He really thought he could get away with this," she said softly. "Just like he thought he could get away with taking your house, your company, your dignity." I watched as Richard was escorted to a police car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no satisfaction in the sight, only a profound sadness for what greed and bitterness had wrought. "What happens now?" Victoria asked. I looked out over the damaged coastline, thinking of my father's vision for this land, of the healing it would need. "Now," I said quietly, "we rebuild." Fall came to Havenport, painting the coastal landscape in rich golds and deep reds. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at Westridge, 3 months of rebuilding, both the damaged coastline and my fractured family. Richard's arrest had made headlines beyond our small town. The story picked up by regional papers as a cautionary tale of corporate fraud and environmental crime. The investigation had uncovered far more than we'd initially suspected. Falsified documents, bribes to local officials, even offshore accounts where company profits had been diverted for years. I stood now on the restored dunes at Westridge, watching as environmental workers planted native grasses to stabilize the sandy soil. The restoration project had become something of a personal mission, a way to honor my father's vision while healing the wounds Richard had inflicted on the land. "It's looking better," Victoria said, joining me on the wooden observation platform we'd constructed. "The environmental engineer says the dune system should be fully functional by next spring." I nodded, feeling the crisp October breeze against my face. "Your grandfather would be pleased." Victoria had thrown herself into the restoration work with unexpected passion, researching coastal ecosystems and working alongside the environmental team. It was as if by healing the land, she was also finding a way to atone for her part in Richard's schemes. The board approved the Conservation Trust. "Proposal," she said, handing me a folder containing the final documents. "Once these are filed, this entire coastline will be permanently protected from development. No future CEO of Harper Development can touch it." I smiled, a warm pride filling me as I looked at my daughter. In the months since the courtroom confrontation, Victoria had transformed. Shedding the brittle, status-conscious persona, Richard had cultivated and rediscovering the compassionate, thoughtful woman I'd always known she could be. "You've done remarkable work on this," I told her, gesturing to the comprehensive plan she'd developed, taking a corporate disaster and turning it into an environmental victory. She shrugged, but I could see the pleasure my words brought her. It felt right, like something I was meant to do. We walked along the newly constructed boardwalk, designed to allow visitors to enjoy the coastline without damaging the fragile ecosystem. In the distance, a team of workers was installing an educational kiosk that would explain the importance of coastal preservation. "Have you visited him?" I asked carefully, broaching the subject we generally avoided. Victoria's expression tightened, slightly. "Last week. He's different, quieter." Richard had accepted a plea deal, confessing to multiple charges of fraud, forgery, and environmental violations in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years. The man who had once dominated boardrooms and social gatherings was now inmate 471832 at the State Correctional Facility 30 miles inland. "He asked about you," Victoria added, glancing at me sideways. "Wanted to know if you were enjoying your victory." I sighed, feeling the familiar mix of emotions that thoughts of Richard always evoked: anger, disappointment, and underneath it all, a lingering sadness for what might have been. "It was never about winning. I know that now," Victoria said softly. I told him so. We continued walking in comfortable silence, eventually reaching the small parking area where our cars waited. The Harper Development Company SUV Victoria now drove stood beside my familiar old Volvo, a visual representation of how our worlds had merged in unexpected ways. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Victoria asked as we prepared to part ways. "The press will be there." Tomorrow marked the official relaunch of Harper Development Group under its new leadership structure. Edward Blake had proven an effective interim CEO, working closely with me to reshape the company according to my father's original vision: ethical development that respected the environment and prioritized community needs over maximum profit. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied. Public speaking had never been my strength, but as majority owner, I needed to address the employees and the press. "Will Nathan be there?" Victoria's cheeks colored slightly at the mention of Nathan Reed, the environmental engineer she'd been working closely with on the restoration project. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more personal over the past months, a development that brought me quiet joy. Nathan was thoughtful and principled. Everything. Richard was not. He said he wouldn't miss it, she confirmed. Though he'll probably hide in the back row. He hates corporate events. We said our goodbyes, and I drove home along the coastal road, watching the afternoon sun glint off the bay. My house welcomed me as it always had, a sanctuary now free from the shadow of Richard's threats. I spent the evening practicing my speech and preparing for the next day's event, falling asleep to the rhythm of waves breaking against the shore below. The company headquarters looked different when I arrived the next morning, literally different, with the old Harper Development logo replaced by a new design that incorporated elements of my father's original vision. The lobby was filled with employees, board members, and local press, an atmosphere of anticipation hanging in the air. Victoria met me at the entrance, professional in a tailored suit but with her grandfather's compass pin on her lapel, a gift I'd given her from my father's belongings, a symbol of finding one's true direction. "Ready?" she asked, handing me a cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, just as I liked it. I took a deep breath. Ready. The presentation went better than I dared hope. Edward Blake outlined the company's new ethical investment strategy. Financial officers presented the restructured accounting systems designed to ensure transparency. Victoria unveiled the Coastal Conservation Trust to enthusiastic applause. And then it was my turn. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at the faces before me, some familiar, many new, all waiting to hear what the previously invisible majority owner had to say. Harper Development began 50 years ago with my father's belief that progress and preservation could coexist. I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. That a company could prosper without exploiting either people or the environment. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that vision. I paused, my eyes finding Victoria in the front row, her encouraging smile giving me strength. Today, we return to our roots, not just as a business strategy, but as a moral imperative. The recent events that have shaken this company and our community have taught us the true cost of prioritizing profit over principle. As I continued outlining our renewed commitment to ethical development, I noticed a familiar figure slipping into the back of the room, Samuel Whitaker, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his judicial robes. Our eyes met briefly, and he nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Leadership isn't about control, I said, nearing the end of my speech. It's about stewardship, caring for what has been entrusted to us and passing it on, improved rather than diminished. That is the standard to which Harper Development will now hold itself accountable. The applause was genuine and sustained. As I stepped away from the podium, Victoria squeezed my hand. Dad would have hated every word of that, she whispered with a small smile. But Grandpa would have loved it. The reception afterward was a blur of congratulations and conversations. I found myself surprisingly comfortable in my new role, discussing projects with employees, who seemed genuinely excited about the company's new direction. Victoria moved through the crowd with natural ease, the corporate world far more her element than mine. As the event wound down, Samuel approached me by the window overlooking the bay. Impressive speech, he said, especially for someone who claims to dislike public speaking. Thank you for coming, I replied, though I'm surprised to see you here, given your ongoing oversight of the legal case. He smiled slightly. The financial crimes portion is with the federal prosecutors now. My involvement is largely complete. He paused, looking out at the view. Besides, I wanted to see James Bennett's daughter reclaim her inheritance, in all senses of the word. Before I could respond, Victoria joined us, accompanied by a tall man, with kind eyes and an outdoorsman's weathered complexion, Nathan Reed. After introductions and brief pleasantries, Samuel excused himself, leaving us to finish the event as a tentative new family unit. Later that evening, Victoria and Nathan joined me for dinner at my home, a casual affair with takeout from our favorite seafood restaurant eaten on the porch as the sun set over the bay. The conversation flowed easily, touching on the restoration project, Nathan's previous work in coastal preservation, and Victoria's growing interest in environmental law. I've been thinking about going back to school, she confessed as we lingered over coffee. There's a program at Coastal University that would allow me to continue working while earning an environmental law degree. That sounds perfect for you, I said, genuinely pleased. The company would benefit from that expertise too. Nathan nodded in agreement. She's already basically doing the job without the title. The professors there are going to love having someone with real-world experience. As they prepared to leave, Victoria hung back, letting Nathan walk ahead to the car. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly. Not just for today, but for giving me the chance to make things right. I touched her cheek gently. That's what family does. Her eyes glistened in the porch light. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Victoria. It's about choosing to move forward instead of staying trapped in the past. I smiled at her, something I had to learn myself. After they left, I sat alone on the porch swing, thinking about the journey of the past 6 months, from the courtroom humiliation to today's corporate triumph. The path had been painful, the wounds deep, but healing had come in unexpected ways. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Saw the news coverage, congratulations. Your father would be proud. I smiled, typing back my thanks before setting the phone aside. The night was clear, stars emerging above the darkening bay, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace in my own life, my own skin, my own power. The company was reclaimed, the coastline was healing, my relationship with my daughter was mending, and I had finally stepped fully into my own story, no longer a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The swing creaked, gently as I rocked, listening to the eternal rhythm of the waves below, breaking, receding, returning, just as they had when my father first showed me this view, just as they would long after all our human dramas had faded into history. Some things, I thought, were permanent, like the truth, like the sea, like the quiet strength that sustains us through life's storms when everything else falls away. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer once more. A full year had passed since that fateful day in the courthouse, a year of transformation both visible and invisible. I stood on the bluff behind my house, watching as workers completed the final touches on the new pathway connecting my property to the West Ridge Nature Preserve. What had once been Richard's ill-fated development project was now a thriving conservation area, open to the public, but carefully managed to protect the fragile ecosystem. The grand opening is all set for next Saturday, Nathan said, approaching with rolled blueprints under his arm. The mayor confirmed she'll be there for the ribbon cutting. And the educational center? I asked. Ahead of schedule. Victoria's been working with the designers to finalize the exhibits. He smiled, the affection in his voice when he mentioned my daughter unmistakable. Their relationship had deepened over the months, built on shared values and mutual respect, everything her relationship with Richard had lacked. I nodded my approval, gazing out at the preserved coastline stretching north from my property. The Bennett Coastal Trust, named for my father, now protected over 5 miles of shoreline from development, funded by a significant portion of Harper Development's profits. Hard to believe what this almost became, Nathan remarked, following my gaze. Luxury condos and a private marina. Some views are worth more undisturbed, I replied, repeating words my father had often said. Nathan excused himself to oversee the final work, leaving me to walk the meandering path back to my house. The garden was in full bloom, hydrangeas and roses creating a riot of color against the weathered shingles. I'd taken to spending more time there since stepping back from day-to-day involvement at Harper Development. The company was thriving under Edward Blake's leadership, with Victoria serving as Director of Environmental Compliance, a position created specifically to ensure the company's projects aligned with our renewed ethical standards. My role had evolved into that of chairwoman, focusing on long-term strategy while leaving operational decisions to those better suited to the corporate world. Inside, I found Victoria in my kitchen, surrounded by papers spread across the table, her laptop open beside a half-empty coffee mug. She looked up as I entered, pushing her reading glasses to the top of her head. "The trust documents are ready for your signature," she said, indicating a folder set apart from the rest. "Once these are filed, the entire northern coastline will be permanently protected." I sat across from her, taking a moment to study my daughter's face. The past year had matured her in subtle ways. There was a groundedness to her. Now a quiet confidence that came from purpose rather than status. Her first semester of environmental law studies had rekindled an intellectual curiosity I remembered from her childhood. "I ran into Mrs. Peterson at the market yesterday," I said as I reviewed the documents. She mentioned seeing Richard on his work release program. Victoria's hands stilled momentarily. "Yes, he's working at the library downtown, reshelving books, 20 hours a week." The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard, who had once mocked my librarian job as beneath him, now performing those same tasks as part of his sentence. "How is he?" "Quieter, thinner." She hesitated. "More human, somehow." "He asked about you again." I signed the trust documents, thinking about Richard's fall from grace. His 5-year sentence had been reduced for good behavior and cooperation with federal investigators, allowing him limited work release after serving 18 months. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated colleagues now lived in a halfway house, performing community service under supervision. "Will you see him when he's fully released?" Victoria asked carefully. I considered the question, one I'd asked myself many times. "I don't know. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." I closed the folder and slid it back to her. "But I've let go of the anger. That's enough for now." Victoria nodded, understanding in her eyes. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave for a meeting at the Conservation Center. At the door, she paused. "Oh, I almost forgot. Judge Whitaker called. He's retiring next month and wanted to invite us to the reception." After she left, I sat on the porch, watching the waves and thinking about Samuel Whitaker. We had developed an unexpected friendship over the past year, occasionally meeting for coffee or attending the same community events. There was a comfort in sharing history with someone, in not having to explain the context of one's life. The afternoon passed in pleasant solitude, the kind I had once feared but now embraced. At 63, I had finally learned the difference between loneliness and being alone, the former a condition of emptiness, the latter a state of peaceful self-sufficiency. The following week brought Samuel's retirement reception, held in the grand hall of the courthouse where our paths had crossed so dramatically a year before. Victoria and Nathan attended with me, the three of us forming a united front as we entered the crowded room. Conversations hushed briefly as people noticed our arrival, but the whispers now held respect rather than pity. The Harper family saga had become something of a local legend, a cautionary tale with a redemptive ending that satisfied the community's sense of justice. Samuel found us by the refreshment table, his face lighting with genuine pleasure. "The guests of honor," he said, embracing me briefly before shaking hands with Nathan and Victoria. "I'm so glad you could come." The evening passed pleasantly, filled with speeches celebrating Samuel's judicial career and plans for his retirement. When the formal program concluded, he sought me out again, drawing me aside to a quieter corner of the room. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small envelope. "It belonged to your father." Inside was a weathered pocket watch, its gold case engraved with my father's initials. "How did you—" "James gave it to me that summer I clerked for him, said to keep it until I'd earned it." Samuel smiled at the memory. "I've carried it for 30 years as a reminder of the second chance he gave me. Now it should return to the Bennett family." I closed my fingers around the watch, feeling the connection to my father it represented. "Thank you, Samuel. This means more than I can say." As the reception wound down, Victoria and Nathan approached, ready to leave. "Judge Whitaker?" Victoria said. "I was hoping you might consider joining the advisory board for the Bennett Coastal Trust. We need someone with your legal expertise." Samuel looked surprised, then pleased. "I'd be honored. Seems fitting to continue working with the Bennett family." Outside, the summer evening was warm and clear, stars emerging above the courthouse square. Victoria and Nathan said their goodbyes, heading off to a late dinner, while I lingered a moment longer with Samuel. "Will you be at the preserve opening next weekend?" I asked. He nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. It's quite something, what you've all accomplished in just a year." "What we've all accomplished," I corrected gently. "If you hadn't recognized me that day in court, recognized the truth of what was happening, you would have found another way," he said with certainty. "You're James Bennett's daughter, after all. Truth has a way of making itself known through people like you." We parted with the ease of old friends, promising to meet at the preserve opening. As I drove home along the familiar coastal road, I found myself thinking about cycles of loss and redemption, about how the worst moments of our lives sometimes lead to unexpected renewals. The preserve opening arrived on a perfect late June day, the kind that showed Havenport at its best, sky an impossible blue, bay sparkling like scattered diamonds, coastal grasses swaying in a gentle breeze. A crowd had gathered for the ceremony, including local officials, environmental activists, and many of my former neighbors who had once whispered about my decline. Victoria stood beside me at the podium, poised and professional as she explained the preserve's features and the educational programs that would be offered. Nathan beamed from the front row while Samuel stood nearby, dignified in retirement. Even Mrs. Peterson was there, her gossip habit momentarily suspended by genuine community pride. When it came my turn to speak, I kept my remarks brief, focusing on my father's vision and the community's role in preserving our natural heritage. As I prepared to cut the ribbon officially opening the James Bennett Coastal Preserve, I spotted an unexpected figure at the back of the gathering, Richard, accompanied by his work release supervisor. Our eyes met across the distance, and after a moment's hesitation, he nodded slightly. Not an apology, not quite, but perhaps an acknowledgement of what I had built, of what he had lost, of the truth that had finally emerged. I returned the nod, then turned back to the ribbon before me. With Victoria's hand alongside mine on the oversized scissors, we cut the ceremonial ribbon together, officially opening the preserve that represented both our past and our future. Afterward, as people explored the new trails and educational displays, I found a quiet moment alone on the observation deck overlooking the restored dunes. The same view I had seen scarred and ravaged a year ago now showed nature's remarkable resilience. Native grasses taking hold, shorebirds returning, the natural rhythm of the coast reasserting itself. Victoria joined me, standing silently at my side as we watched the waves. "I saw Dad," she said finally. "Yes, I saw him too." She hesitated. "He asked if he could meet with us sometime, after his release, to apologize." I considered this, feeling neither the sharp anger of before nor any particular eagerness for reconciliation. "Perhaps, when the time is right." Victoria nodded, understanding that healing had its own timeline, that some wounds needed distance before they could be directly addressed. "He said something else," she added quietly, "that he finally understands what Grandpa was trying to build, what you protected." Below us, Nathan was leading a group of school children along the boardwalk, pointing out the different species of plants that stabilized the dunes. Samuel stood chatting with the mayor near the new educational center that bore my father's name. Community members wandered the paths, claiming this preserved piece of coastline as their own shared heritage. Your grandfather used to say that we don't really own the land, I told Victoria, my voice soft with memory. We're just its caretakers for a little while, responsible for passing it on better than we found it. She smiled, linking her arm through mine. I think we've done that. We have, I agreed, feeling a deep contentment that transcended the triumph of vindication. This was something richer, the satisfaction of having honored not just my father's legacy but my own values, of having stood firm when it would have been easier to crumble. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, guests began to depart. Victoria and Nathan left to oversee the closing of the event, while I remained on the observation deck, savoring the solitude and the view that had been saved. A year ago, I had entered a courtroom feeling powerless, watching my daughter mock me while my ex-husband plotted to strip me of everything. I had been dismissed, underestimated, nearly erased, until truth and integrity had reasserted themselves, changing everything in an instant. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. I thought of all. The sunsets I had watched from this coastline, as a child holding my father's hand, as a young mother with Victoria perched on my hip, as a woman fighting to protect what mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings and trust management, Victoria's growing relationship with Nathan, the ongoing healing of family bonds. But tonight, in this moment, I stood complete in myself. No longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had reclaimed. The truth had spoken, and in its voice I had found not just justice, but peace. As I turned to leave, the final rays of sunlight caught the waves breaking against the shore, constant, powerful, eternal, like dignity, like truth, like the quiet strength that sustains us when everything else falls away.